Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our set of introductory comments to psychology. We are in the William J. Elmhorst Mary Spills Pearson High School 3rd edition psychology textbook. We're in chapter 1, we're in module 1, we're at page 1, although quickly we'll jump to page 3. Now our topic here is the science of psychology, the historical development and perspective. So right away, we're going to be building on some of the information that we have already studied. Our assumptions that you've been working with us at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side is our playlist. And I'm hopeful already that you followed some of our previous conversations. We've spent some time thinking about early kind of historical, psychological antecedents in Plato. We spent some time with Apology and Republic. We spent some time with Aristotle and Aristotelian poetic theories. We spent a little time with Greek drama, Sophocles, Euripides, and the like. And then finally, we spent a few minutes with Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Now, we're ready to turn to Chapter 1, Module 1. Chapter 1, the science of psychology. Module 1, the historical development and perspectives. Now, if you're looking at page 3, and I hope you are, we have a number of learning objectives I want you to pay attention to. We're going to define psychology as a field. We're going to study the 4 primary goals as a science of psychology. We're going to describe how psychology developed as a science, describe perspectives used to understand psychology today. We're going to explain how psychology developed as a scientific discipline. And then finally, we're going to describe the important subfields of psychology, discuss the value of research with human and non-human animals, and finally, describe the role psychology plays in improving both society and people's lives. Now, while you're taking notes and annotating, I'm hopeful right away that you will find yourself identifying these modules and their subparts. So notice on page 3, it's trace the development of psychology as a science 1.1, define psychology as a field of study and identify psychology's 4 primary goals as a science. Let's enjoy now the text. Again, I'm reading to help those of you who are struggling readers, and obviously we'll make some observations along the way. Now notice the importance of definition right away. We've met already Socrates, who always said define your terms. So here we are already defining psychology as a field of science, of study, and identify the 4 primary goals of psychology as a science. Some people believe psychology is just the study of people and what motivates their behavior. Psychologists do study people, but they study non-human animals as well. To better understand what motivates behavior, psychologists study not only what people and non-human animals do, but also what happens in their bodies, their brains as they do it. The study of psychology is important not only to psychologists. Psychology is a hub science. You want to make a note of that in your annotations. And findings from psychological research are cited and used in many other fields as diverse as cancer research, climate change, and even dealing with pandemics, such as, of course, COVID-19. And by the way, I'm going to stay away from reading all of the attributions, but I do want you to study the list of references at the back end of this book, R1 through 42, for all your referencing there, all right? Before examining the field of psychology, take this survey that we will do online. Psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So there's your operational definition. Behavior includes all of our outward or overt actions and reactions, such as talking, facial expressions, movement. The term mental processes refers to all the internal, covert, hidden activity of our minds, such as thinking, feeling, remembering. Why scientific? To study behavior and mental processes in both non-human animals and humans, researchers have to observe them. Whenever a human being is observing anyone or anything, there's always a possibility the observer will see only what they expect to see. Psychologists don't want to let these possible biases cause them to make faulty observations. Now, obviously, you'll see a footnote there for biases being those personal judgments based on beliefs rather than facts, right? They want to be as precise as possible, measure as carefully as they can, so they use a systematic approach. Notice your footnote for systematic, the systematic according to a fixed or ordered plan. A systematic approach to study psychology scientifically. I'm on to page 4, psychology's goals. Every science has the common goal of learning how things work. The goals specifically aimed at uncovering the mysteries of human and non-human animal behavior are description, explanation, prediction, and control. First, to description. What is happening? The first step in understanding anything is to describe it. Description involves observing a behavior and noting everything about it. What's happening, where it happens, to whom it happens, under what circumstances it seems to happen. For example, a psychologist might wonder why so many computer programmers seem to be men. the psychologist makes further observations and notes that many non-techies, right, stereotypically perceive the life and environment of a computer programmer as one in which someone lives and breathes at the computer, surrounded by computer games, junk food, science fiction gadgets, characteristics that add to a very masculine ambiance. Notice your footnote here for masculine, right? That's what seems to be happening. The psychologist's observations are a starting point for the next goal. Why do women seem to avoid going into this environment? Second heading, why is it happening? Based on their observations, the psychologist might try to come up with a tentative explanation, such as women feel they do not belong in such stereotypical masculine surroundings. In other words, they're trying to understand or find an explanation for the lower proportion of women in this field. Finding explanations for behavior is a very important step in the process of forming theories of behavior. A theory is a general explanation of the set of observations or facts. The goal of description provides the observation, and the goal of explanation helps to build the theory. The preceding example comes from a real experiment conducted by psychologist Spina Sharon and colleagues. Professor Sharon, who teaches psychology at the University of Washington, Seattle, set up 4 experiments with more than 250 female student participants who were not studying computer science. In the first experiment, students came into a small classroom that had one of 2 sets of objects, either Star Trek posters, video game boxes, Coke cans, or nature posters, or a dictionary, coffee mugs, among other things. Told to ignore the objects because they were sharing the room with another class, the students spent several minutes in the classroom. While they were sitting in the classroom, they were asked to fill out a questionnaire asking about their attitude toward computer programming. Although the attitudes of male students were not different between the 2 environments, female students exposed to the stereotypically masculine setup were less interested in computer programming than those who were exposed to the non-stereotypical environment. The 3 other similar experiments yield the same results. Next heading, when will it happen again? Determining what will happen in the future is making a prediction. In the Sharon et al. Study, the prediction is clear. If we want more women to go into computer programming, we must do something to change either the environment or the perception of the environment typically associated with this field. This is the purpose of the last of the 4 goals of psychology, changing or modifying behavior. Notice the next heading now, control. How can it be changed? The focus of control, or the modification of some behavior, is to change a behavior from an undesirable one, such as women avoiding a certain academic major, to a desirable one, such as one more equality in career choices. Professor Sharon suggests that changing the image of computer programming may help increase the number of women choosing to go into this field. Not all psychological investigations will try to meet all 4 of these goals. In some cases, the main focus might be on description, prediction, as it would be for a personality theorist who wants to know what people are like, description, and what they might do in certain situations, prediction. Some psychologists are interested in both description and explanation, as in the case with experimental psychologists who design research to find explanations for observed, that is to say, described behavior. Therapists may be more interested in controlling or influencing behavior and mental processes, although the other 3 goals would be important in achieving this objective. Although these goals have not really changed over the years since psychology's beginnings, the methods of achieving them certainly have changed. In the next section, we'll take a look at the early pioneers in psychology. Psychology is a relatively new field in the realm of the sciences. It's only about 140 years old. It's not that no one thought about why people and non-human animals do the things they do before then. Obviously, we know that from our study of Plato or Aristotle. On the contrary, many philosophers, medical doctors, and physiologists thought about little else, particularly with regard to people. Famous philosophers, such as we mentioned, Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes, tried to understand or explain the human mind and its connection to the physical body. Medical doctors and physiologists wondered about the physical connection between the body and the brain. For example, physician and psychiatrist Gustav Fechner is often credited with performing some of the first scientific experiments that would form a basis for experimentation in psychology with the studies of perception. And physician Hermann von Helmholtz performed groundbreaking experiments in visual auditory perception. Let's go on to section 1.2, describe how psychology developed as a science. Let's do a little bit of history. In the beginning, von Titchener and James, the people who were psychologists, pioneers, came from very different backgrounds. Eventually, these varied ideas were recognized as the beginnings of a new field of inquiry, psychology. It really all started to come together in a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. Of course, the Germans will play a huge role in the study of our psychology approach. It was here that Wilhelm Wundt, a psychologist of 1832 to 1920, a physiologist, attempted to apply scientific principles to the study of the human mind. In his laboratory, students from around the world were taught to study the structure of the human mind. Wundt believed that consciousness, the state of being aware of external events, could be broken down into thoughts, experiments, emotions, and other basic elements. To inspect these non-physical elements, students had to learn to think objectively about their own thoughts. After all, they could hardly read someone else's mind. Wundt called this process objective introspection. The prefix intro means inside, and the root word spect means to look. The process of objectively examining and measuring one's own thoughts and mental activities. I'm at the top of page 6 now. For example, Wundt might place an object, such as a rock, into a student's hand and have the student tell him everything that they were feeling as a result of having the rock in their hand, all the sensations stimulated by the rock. This was really the first attempt by anyone to bring objectivity, notice your footnote for objectivity, expressing or dealing with facts and conditions as they really are, and measurement to the concept of psychology. This attention to objectivity, together with the establishment of the first true psychological laboratory in psychology, is why Wundt is known as the founder of psychology, and of course you have a photograph of him there on page 6. Tishner and structuralism in America. One of Wundt's students was Edward Tishner, 1867 to 1927, an Englishman who eventually took Wundt's ideas to Cornell University, Ithaca, New York. Tishner expanded on Wundt's original ideas, calling his new viewpoint structuralism. You want to write that down. The root word struct means to build, because the focus of study was the structure of the mind. He believed that every experience could be broken down into its individual emotions and sensations. Although Tishner agreed with Wundt that consciousness could be broken down into its basic elements, Tishner also believed that objective introspection could be used on thoughts as well as on physical sensations. For example, Tishner might have asked his students to introspect about things that are blue rather than actually giving them a blue object and asking for reactions to it. Such an exercise might have led to something like the following. What is blue? There are blue things like the sky or birds' feathers. Blue is cool and restful. Blue is calm, and so on. In 1894, one of Tishner's students at Cornell University became famous for becoming the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology. Her name was Margaret F. Washburn, and she was Tishner's only graduate student for that year. In 1908, she published a book on non-human animal behavior that was considered an important work in that era of psychology, The Animal Mind. Washburn, 1908. Structuralism was a dominant force in the early days of psychology, but it eventually died out in the early 1900s as the structuralists were busily fighting amongst themselves over just which key elements of experience were the most important. A competing view arose not long after Wundt's laboratory was established, shortly before structuralism came to America. William James and functionalism. Harvard University was the first school in America to offer classes in psychology in the late 1870s. These classes were taught by one of Harvard's most illustrious instructors, William James. There are your dates, 1842 to 1910. James began teaching anatomy and physiology, but as his interest in psychology developed, he began teaching psychology almost exclusively. His comprehensive textbook on the subject principles of psychology is so brilliantly written that copies are still in print, and certainly one that I'm going to recommend that we all read. Unlike Wundt and Tishner, James was more interested in the importance of consciousness to everyday life rather than just the analysis of it. He believed that the scientific study of consciousness itself was not yet possible. Conscious ideas are constantly flowing in an ever-changing stream. And once you start thinking about what you were just thinking about, what you were thinking about is no longer what you were thinking about. It's what you are thinking about. And, excuse me, I'm a little dizzy. I think you get the picture anyway. Top of page 7. Instead, James focused on how the mind allows people to function in the real world, how people work, play, adapt to their surroundings, a viewpoint he called functionalism. So write that down as opposed to structuralism, okay? He was heavily influenced, obviously, by Charles Darwin's ideas about natural selection, in which physical traits that help an animal adapt to its environment and survive are passed on to its offspring. If physical traits could aid in survival, why couldn't behavioral traits do the same? non-human animals and people whose behavior helped them to survive would pass those traits on to their offspring, perhaps by teaching or even by mechanism of heredity. Remember that this was early in the days of trying to understand how heredity worked. For example, a behavior such as avoiding the eyes of others in an elevator can be seen as a way of protecting one's personal space, a kind of territorial protection that may have its roots in the primitive need to protect one's home, source of food, water from invaders. Or it could be as a way of avoiding what might seem like a challenge to another person, right? One of James's earliest students was Mary Whitman Calkins, who completed every course and requirement for earning a PhD, but was denied that degree by Harvard University because she was a woman. Historically, and even still today in various cases, universities and other institutions applied systematic barriers to women and people of color to restrict their participation in academia. Calkins eventually established a psychological laboratory at Wellesley College. Her work was some of the earliest research in the area of human memory and the psychology of the self. In 1905, she became the first female president of the American Psychological Association. Unlike Washburn, Calkins was never awarded the elusive PhD degree despite a successful career as a professor and researcher. Women were not the only marginalized group to make contributions in the early days of psychology. In 1920, Francis Cecil Sumner became the first black American to earn a PhD in psychology at Clark University. He eventually became the chair of the psychology department at Howard University and is assumed by many to be the founder of Black American psychology. Kenneth and Mamie Clark worked to show the negative effects of school segregation on black American children. In the 1940s, Hispanic psychologist George Sanchez conducted research in the area of intelligence testing, focusing on the cultural biases in such tests. Other names of noted psychologists of color include Dr. Charles Henry Thompson, the first black American to receive a doctorate in educational psychology in 1925. Dr. Albert Sidney Beckham, senior assistant psychologist at the National Committee for Mental Hygiene at the Illinois Institute for Juvenile Research in the early 1930s. Dr. Robert Princess Daniel, who became a president of Shaw University in North Carolina and finally the president of Virginia State College. Dr. Ennis Beverly Prosser, 1897 to 1934, who was the first black American woman to earn a PhD in educational psychology. Dr. Howard Dr. Hale Long, who became a dean of administration in Wilberforce State College in Ohio. And Dr. Ruth Howard, who was the first black American woman to earn a PhD in psychology, not educational psychology, in 1934 from the University of Minnesota. Since those early days, psychology has seen an increase in the contributions of women and people of color, although the percentages are still small when compared to the population at large. The American Psychological Association's Office of Ethnic Minority Affairs features notable psychologists as part of their Ethnicity and Health in American series. Their website provides brief biographies of underrepresented groups and work of research related to chronic health conditions for several groups. In the new field of psychology, functionalism offered an alternative viewpoint to the structuralists. But like so many of psychology's early ideas, it is no longer a major perspective. Instead, one can find elements of functionalism in the modern fields of educational psychology, studying the application of psychological concepts to education, and industrial organizational psychology, studying the application of psychological concepts to business organizations and industry, as well as other areas in psychology. Functionalism also played a part in the development of one of the most important perspectives, more modern perspectives, evolutionary psychology, discussed later in this chapter. We now come to the three influential approaches section. While the structuralists and functionalists argued with each other and among themselves, other psychologists were looking at psychology in other ways. Let's begin with Gestalt psychology. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Max Wertheimer, like James, objected to the structuralist point of view, but for different reasons. Wertheimer believed that psychological events such as perceiving and sensing, notice your footnotes, could not be broken down into any smaller elements and still be properly understood. For example, you can take a smartphone apart, but then you no longer have a smartphone, you have a pile of unconnected bits and pieces. Or just as a melody is made up of individual notes that can only be understood if the notes are in the correct relationship to one another. So perception can only be understood as a whole entire event, hence the familiar saying the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Wertheimer and others believed that people naturally seek out patterns, holes, in the sensory information available to them. Wertheimer and others devoted their efforts to studying sensation and perception in this new perspective, Gestalt. And here the word Gestalt is noted as a German word meaning an organized whole. Or configuration, which fits well with the focus on the studying whole patterns rather than small pieces of them. Pay attention to figure 1-1 with the Gestalt perception there and the little activity where the eye tends to fill in the blanks. Okay? Figure 1-1 for an example of Gestalt psychology for patterns. Today, Gestalt ideas are part of the study of cognitive psychology, a field focusing not only on perception, but also on learning, memory, thought processes, and problem solving. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about it later. The basic Gestalt principles of perception are still taught within this newer field. Let's now go to Sigmund Freud, the theory of psychoanalysis. It should be clear by now that psychology didn't start in one place and at one particular time. People of several different viewpoints were trying to promote their own perspective on the study of the human mind and behavior. Up to now, this chapter is focused on the physiologists who became interested in psychology with a focus on understanding consciousness, but little else. The medical profession took a whole different approach to psychology. Sigmund Freud, who became a noted physician in Austria, while the structuralists were arguing, the functionalists were specializing, and the Gestaltists were looking at the big picture. Freud was a neurologist, a medical doctor, who specialized in disorders of the nervous system. He and his colleagues had long sought a way to understand the patients who were coming to them for help. Freud's patients experienced nervous disorders for which he and other doctors could find no physical cause. Therefore, it was thought that the cause must be in the mind. That is where Freud began to explore. He proposed that there is an unconscious or unaware mind into which we push or repress all of our threatening urges and desires. He believed that these repressed urges